Okay, so today's question on Trust Me, I'm a Philosopher is, which news sources do Americans use and trust? And of course, trust in the media is a nice, uncontroversial topic for us to be probing today. I'm sure we all have complete and unquestioning trust in the information that the media puts out in front of us. Joking aside, it's a hugely important topic. If you think about the way that information is shared at scale across the world, most of us are going to be getting information, our access to what's going on in politics, in current affairs, in sports, in cooking, in technology, from news sources. And so the question of whether we trust news sources, how we use them, how we engage with them is hugely important. And so it's absolute catnip for a channel like Trust Me, I'm a Philosopher, where we explore what trust is, why it matters, and how to build it. So as you can see, the information source that we'll be using today is YouGov's 2025 poll of trust in media. And there are all sorts of interesting bits and pieces that they're claiming coming out from the research. For instance, that Democrats and Republicans find common ground on sources for financial news, but seem to hold vastly different opinions on most other news sources, including the two used most by Americans, which is CNN and Fox News. Let me know in the comments, what's your view of those news sources? I'm sure that anyone watching this has a view on those sources. And so in the latest poll from YouGov, they asked Americans about 52 news sources, which is quite a large number, including their use of it and its trustworthiness. And this is part of a series of surveys that YouGov have conducted going back over the last few years. Before we get any further, let me know in the comments who you think is going to come out as the most trusted news source by Americans. Be really interesting to hear what you think it's going to be. So, as you can see from the research here, some of the questions that YouGov were asking were around how people get the news, whether they seek it out, whether they've consumed news from particular sources, which is really important to establish usage patterns. And there are a bunch of different questions that they ask that if you're interested, you should absolutely go and check out for yourselves. I'll give the link below. But the next questions that I really want to focus on are the ones that start to ask whether or not people have a favourable or unfavourable opinion of particular kinds of news source. So for instance, journalism, social media, the news media, and the press. And I guess I can see why this favourability thing is in there, just so long as we're not using it to report on trust. I could have a really unfavourable opinion of someone and yet trust them completely. So for instance, suppose I have a family member who I really dislike. They're incredibly boring and slightly passive aggressive, but nonetheless, they are scrupulously reliable. They always tell the truth. Perhaps that's a component of why I don't like them. They're always really blunt and just tell me the truth. I might have a net unfavourable opinion of that person and yet still trust them loads. Obviously, I trust all of my family and love all of them very dearly. So I'm not talking about a real case, but a hypothetical one. The next question I want to probe is actually question number 13 from the YouGov poll. We're going to get really into the weeds here. How trustworthy do you rate the news that you personally consume on a regular basis? Okay, we're supposed to be getting to a position where we understand how much Americans trust particular news sources. This question isn't asking about that. It's asking about how deserving of our trust that news source is. And again, I can view someone as being incredibly trustworthy and yet not actively trust them to do anything. So for instance, maybe I judge a particular retailer to be incredibly trustworthy. I just don't ever buy any of their products because they operate in a product category where I don't buy anything. So we just need to be a bit careful that we're not getting too much by way of conflicting signals here in our net messages. Because if we're thinking about trust, we shouldn't be asking questions about trustworthiness. The two things are subtly different. And something really weird then happens around question 20 that I want to spend a little bit of time sitting with. So the question is, how trustworthy is news from the following? And they give a bunch of different news sources like the Weather Channel, BBC, and so on. How trustworthy is news? Right. Well, let's think about what trustworthiness is. It's about having the right kinds of characteristics to be trusted. So let's think about what we might look for in a person. So we would look for honesty, integrity, reliability, those sorts of traits when it comes to telling the truth, I assume. So if we're looking at, is someone trustworthy to tell me the truth? I'm going to look for those kinds of traits. Can we talk about news as being trustworthy? I mean, news presumably is a presented set of information. News doesn't have character traits. It's the wrong sort of thing to have character traits, right? News would be spoken, or it would be written, or I guess it could be sung if there is a singing news channel. Like, we can't really then talk about the news as being deserving of our trust, right? It's the people who produce it that are deserving of our trust. And so I'm not quite sure that's a great question for YouGov to be asking. How trustworthy is the news from the following? I think there's scope for a little bit of ambiguity to be coming in there. If the report from YouGov is telling us how much Americans trust news sources, it really shouldn't be asking questions about how trustworthy is news from the following. Because again, it's not asking us about, do you trust this news? It's asking, do you think this news is deserving of our trust? And something can be deserving of our trust without us giving it, and we can give it in cases where it's not deserving. So this is just not a great question. And unfortunately, that's kind of it, right? Those are the questions that they're asking in the YouGov poll about trust in news. Again, go check it out for yourself. I think there is some interesting data there. I'm just not quite sure that what YouGov are reporting that it says is actually what it says. I'm not totally convinced that this tells us whether Americans trust those news sources. But to the grand reveal, what is the news source that most Americans, according to YouGov, will regard as being trusted? The Weather Channel is the victor, as it has been in 2022, 2023 and 2024. To quote from the YouGov reporting, Americans are 49 percentage points more likely to call the Weather Channel trustworthy as they are to call it untrustworthy, up from 43 last year. So whatever the Weather Channel has been doing, it should keep doing. Like last year, the Weather Channel is followed by two public broadcasters, the BBC and PBS. Bit of good news there for public broadcasting, but huge props to the Weather Channel for continuing their reign of YouGov's most trusted news source. For those of you who follow such things, I'm guessing that that's an unsurprising outcome. Maybe we should do this again next year and see whether the Weather Channel can win again, the dominant champion in the trusted space. That's enough for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, like the video and subscribe to the channel. It means a huge amount when folks do that. Until next time, stay suitably trusting.